Welcome to the deep dive. You know the image. The fierce warriors, the dragon-headed longboats, the raids, Vikings. They're sort of fixed in our imagination, often as these unwashed, maybe brutal figures.
That stereotype is powerful, isn't it? It's definitely the image that jumps to mind first.
Right.
But, when you actually dig into the archaeological finds, the historical accounts from the time, a much more intricate picture starts to emerge. Yeah, you start seeing the details of their everyday lives, things that get totally overshadowed by the raiding and warring narratives.
And that's exactly our mission in this deep dive. We've gathered a bunch of sources that really challenge those easy assumptions. We're trying to go beyond the battle axe, the longboat, to explore two surprising aspects: their personal hygiene and their funeral practices.
It's like looking at the actual people behind the sagas. What does something like a simple comb or, the way they buried their dead, what does that really tell us about their values, their world?
And our sources seem to suggest something pretty unexpected, that Vikings might have been far cleaner than we ever thought, that everyday things like combs held this incredible, maybe even mystical significance, and that their funerals were these deeply complex reflections of their beliefs about the afterlife. Ready to get into it?
Yeah, let's unpack what the sources are really telling us.
Okay, so let's jump straight into something that completely upends that dirty Viking image. Were they actually as grubby as the myths make out?
Well, the evidence is actually pretty compelling that the answer is a definite no. That idea of them being just universally unkempt, it doesn't really hold up when you look at the archaeology and the historical research.
Right.
Our sources point to Vikings caring quite a bit about being clean.
How much are we talking, though? Like a quick splash now and then, or was it more routine?
The research suggests regular bathing, at least once a week, seems common, which frankly was pretty frequent compared to many other groups in Europe back then.
Once a week? Okay, that's way better than the movie show.
Right. And some accounts even hint that daily bathing might have been possible, at least for some people.
So where would they do this? Just jump in a river or a lake?
Exactly. In warmer weather, yeah, natural water sources, rivers, lakes near their settlements, maybe hot springs if they were lucky enough to have some nearby.
Okay, but what about those long, dark, frozen Scandinavian winters? Can't exactly take a dip in an icy lake every Saturday.
Well, that's where the sources show something really interesting, the use of saunas.
Saunas, like proper heated rooms.
Yeah, they built these heated rooms, sometimes getting up to like 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And they weren't just for getting warm, they were specifically for cleansing. The heat and steam, it creates a bacteria-killing environment, perfect for cleaning bodies and clothing, especially when jumping in a lake wasn't really an option.
So the Vikings basically had their own version of a spa day.
Yeah.
That shows a real commitment to hygiene, doesn't it? It's not just about, washing off mud.
It really goes beyond just basic cleanliness. The sources show a strong focus on personal grooming as well.
Okay, so what did that involve?
Yeah.
Hair, teeth, that kind of thing.
Both were important, yeah. Hair care, for instance, seems like it was quite meticulous. They washed their hair regularly, wanted it looking sleek and shiny.
What were they using? Not modern shampoo, I guess.
No, definitely not soap as we know it for hair. Some sources suggest they actually avoided soap on the scalp, thought it was bad for it.
Oh, interesting. So what then?
They might use salt water to loosen dirt, rinses made with vinegar that's got antibacterial properties, maybe stuff from tree sap or birch bark, and they even use natural oils to keep hair nourished.
Wow, so their own kind of natural hair care routine.
Yeah.
What about teeth? Dental hygiene sounds like it would have been a real challenge back then.
It was tough, yeah, but the sources really highlight that oral hygiene was seen as important, and not just for, health reasons.
Okay.
It seems to have had spiritual connotations too, like they believed good teeth could help ward off evil spirits or bad luck.
Health and spiritual protection from brushing your teeth. Okay. What tools did they even have?
Well, archaeology's turned up things like twigs, bone scrapers, and yes, even specific little combs used for cleaning teeth.
Combs for teeth.
Seems like it. And accounts also mention using herbal rinses and healers, mixing things like fennel or mint with honey maybe to rinse the mouth or put on sore spots.
So they had tools. They had remedies.
Ah.
Did it actually work? How were Viking teeth overall, based on the evidence?
Well, this is where the archaeology gives us a bit more of a mixed picture. Studies of teeth from grave sites, they definitely show high rates of cavities, plaque, gum disease, and enamel wear, too.
Okay, so despite their efforts, they still had dental problems. That makes sense.
They did. And the sources suggest a couple of potential reasons. Their diet, for one, probably had a fair bit of sugar, think honey mead, dried fruits, that kind of thing.
Right.
And also, some of those cleaning methods, while trying, might have actually been quite abrasive. Using a pumice stone or something could damage enamel over time.
That adds up. And I imagine dental health probably wasn't the same for everyone, depending on status or where you lived.
Absolutely. The research notes that. It likely varied quite a bit based on social status, location, access to different foods and resources would make a difference, you know?
So they have all these grooming tools we hear about, ear spoons, tweezers, toothpicks, and then there are the combs. Our sources make it sound like combs are just everywhere in Viking archaeology.
That's absolutely right. Viking combs are incredibly common finds. We're talking thousands excavated, settlements, burial sites right across the Norse world, Scandinavia, the British Isles, even parts of Eastern Europe.
The sheer number implies they weren't just for the rich, right? These weren't luxury items.
Not at all. Their abundance is like really strong evidence that they were a fundamental part of daily life for pretty much everyone, no matter their social standing. Necessities, not luxuries.
And the sources mention how well-made they often were.
They do. They were usually crafted from bone or antler materials Vikings were really skilled at working with. And they weren't just simple, rough things. Often meticulously constructed from multiple plates riveted together made them quite sturdy.
So, practical, functional,
Yeah.
but also beautiful.
Yes. That's the really striking part. Many of the ones that survived have this intricate, beautiful art on them. Detailed animal shapes, geometric patterns, that classic Viking knotwork.
On a comb.
On a comb. This level of artistry on such a common, everyday item, it's really telling.
It tells us they weren't just tools you used and threw away. They were valued possessions.
Exactly. They weren't disposable. They
Yeah.
were clearly cherished personal items, maybe reflecting the owner's taste, perhaps even their status. This dedication to craft, even on something so practical, it just pushes back so hard against that simplistic, dirty barbarian stereotype.
Yeah, it shows real appreciation for both usefulness and, well, looking good.
Precisely. And when you see the sheer number of these combs, plus those other grooming tools we mentioned, it's basically archaeological proof that Vikings cared about how they looked.
It's concrete evidence.
It really is. It shows that personal cleanliness, a well-groomed appearance, these were important values. A tidy look could signal social standing, self-respect, maybe even a sort of ritual purity. It just paints a very different picture of Viking people.
Okay, so they were essential tools, personal items, objects of beauty. But the sources hint there might be even more to the story of the comb. Could they have held some kind of deeper, maybe spiritual significance?
This is where it gets really fascinating and a bit mysterious. Combs were clearly deeply personal. People carried them constantly, part of their immediate belongings. Used for hair, beards, and, yeah, practically for things like delousing. They were undeniably tied to an individual's identity.
And didn't Norse mythology itself view hair as pretty significant?
It absolutely did. In Norse folklore, yeah, hair often comes up linked to magical powers, strength, the spirit of a person, sometimes even seen as a conduit for magic.
Right.
So given that whole belief system, it makes perfect sense to wonder about the tools used to care for that very significant part of the body, you know?
So the comb itself might have been used in rituals or something like that.
That's the intriguing possibility the sources raise. Could they have been used in, say, divination practices, or perhaps even carried as protective amulets? We see these archaeological clues sometimes in how combs are found in graves.
How so?
Well, sometimes they're placed in positions that don't seem purely practical or utilitarian. This kind of placement suggests maybe a ritual purpose, as grave goods specifically meant to go with or protect the deceased on their journey to the afterlife.
Giving them something important, something personal for the next world.
Exactly. Now, it's important to say, direct evidence for widespread magical use tied specifically to combs. It's scarce. We don't have, Viking instruction manuals for magic combs.
Right.
But the combination of how common they were, how personal they were, the Norse beliefs about hair, and those specific finds in graves, it adds this really captivating layer of mystery. It hints at a potentially hidden spiritual dimension connected to these very ordinary, everyday objects.
That idea of objects for the journey to the afterlife,
Yeah.
it leads us perfectly into the other major focus of our sources, Viking funeral rites.
which sound incredibly complex and tell us so much about their beliefs about death itself.
Oh, they were absolutely central to Viking society. Funeral rites weren't just about, getting rid of a body. They were these elaborate ceremonies. The goal was honoring the dead and, really critically, ensuring their safe and successful passage to the afterlife, according to Norse beliefs.
How would they prepare someone who had died? What did the sources say?
The sources describe the body often being dressed in their finest clothes, sometimes even garments made specially for the burial.
And then came the grave goods. That's something we often hear about Vikings buried with their stuff. Yes, grave goods were absolutely essential, and the types of items included could vary enormously. It really depended on the person's social status, their wealth. You find anything from weapons, jewelry, tools, household items, to animals like horses or dogs.
Animals, too.
Yeah, and in some cases, sadly, even enslaved people were included.
Wow. And the purpose of putting all this in the grave?
The core belief was that these items would be needed, that they'd be useful in the hereafter. They provided comfort, they allowed the dead person to sort of maintain their status in the afterlife, and essentially equip them for whatever came next.
Were there big ceremonies involved, too? Feasts and things?
Definitely. The sources describe ceremonies that could be quite complex, sometimes including large feasts to honor the deceased, maybe even sacrifices that were intended to help that crucial journey to the afterlife.
Right.
The Vikings strongly believed that the way you were sent off, the manner of your funeral, significantly impacted your status and your destiny in the next world.
When we think of Viking funerals, the most dramatic images are usually those ship burials, or maybe big cremations.
Those are certainly the most iconic practices, the ones captured vividly by the sources in archaeology. Ship burials, for instance, were typically reserved for the most important people in society. Powerful chieftains, wealthy traders, maybe women of very high status.
How did that actually work? Did they bury a whole ship?
Sometimes, yes. It involved placing the deceased and all their grave goods aboard an actual ship, or sometimes in a stone setting built in the shape of a boat. Then this whole vessel would either be buried under a huge mound of earth or, famously, set on fire and sent out across the water.
The symbolism there feels incredibly strong. A ship for the journey.
It really is. The ship symbolized the journey itself, right? The passage to the afterlife. And it was so deeply tied to Viking identity as seafarers, explorers. It represented their ability to navigate not just the physical seas, but also the spiritual realm after death.
Is there a famous example?
Oh yeah, the Oseberg ship burial is a prime one, 9th century. It held 2 high-status women and was just packed with lavish goods, carriages, chests, beautiful textiles, all inside the ship itself.
Incredible. And what about cremation? Was that always linked to the ship burials, setting the ship on fire?
Cremation was also a really widespread practice, not just for ship burials. It involved burning the body and their possessions on a pyre. The belief there was that the smoke from the fire would actually help carry the soul up to the afterlife. But yes, those burning boat burials you see depicted, those are definitely dramatic examples of cremation ceremonies for the elite.
And all of these different practices, they're rooted in core Norse beliefs about death and what comes after.
Absolutely. Norse belief didn't really see death as a final end. It was more of a transition to another existence. And preparation for this transition, it really started during life. Your deeds, how you lived, were believed to influence your standing, maybe even your destination after death.
And the most famous destination we hear about is Valhalla, right? Odin's Hall.
Valhalla was hugely significant, especially for warriors. It was Odin's great hall in Asgard, the destination for those considered worthy who died bravely in combat.
Okay.
The promise of Valhalla, where they'd feast and fight eternally, that provided immense comfort to warriors. And it heavily influenced their funerals, burying them with weapons and armor, for instance, so they were ready for those endless battles. An elaborate ship burial could definitely be seen as ensuring an honorable entrance to Odin's Hall.
But not everyone went to Valhalla, surely.
Yeah.
And not all Vikings died in battle.
Correct. The Norse afterlife wasn't just Valhalla. It included other realms, too, like Helheim, which was ruled by the goddess Hel. That was typically seen as the place for those who died of sickness or old age. And importantly, funeral practices weren't the same everywhere across the vast Norse world.
Ah, so there were regional differences.
Yes, the sources definitely show diversity. Ship burials seem particularly common and elaborate in Norway. In Sweden, you tend to see more of a mix of both inhumation, which is just burial of the body in the ground, and cremation. Denmark often featured burial mounds and those really impressive stone settings shaped like boats.
So the choice between burning or burying wasn't just random.
Probably not just personal preference, no. It likely involved a mix of religious beliefs, social factors, maybe even practical considerations depending on the region and time.
And did these practices change much over the whole Viking Age?
Significantly, yes. In the earlier parts, burials could be simpler, maybe just with personal items. As the era went on, we see cremation and those more elaborate ship burials becoming more common, especially for the elite.
Right.
Then, of course, with the gradual influence and eventual adoption of Christianity, there was a slow shift, a move towards churchyard burials, and generally a decline in burying people with lots of grave goods.
Was there a period where the old ways and the new ways sort of blended together?
Definitely seems like there was a transition period. You find archaeological sites with burials that show a mix, maybe someone buried in a Christian manner, but still with some traditional Norse symbols or a few grave goods included. Sites like Valsgarda in Sweden, which date to the 7th century before widespread Christianity, they give us incredible insights into the complex customs before that big religious shift happened.
Let's circle back to the grave goods for a second. You mentioned they weren't just random stuff, but held specific meanings. What did those different kinds of items symbolize?
The grave goods seem carefully chosen, yeah. They reflected the person's life and were meant to provide for their needs or maintain their status in the afterlife. Weapons, for instance, they weren't just status symbols, they were crucial for someone with a warrior identity. Signified their readiness for eternal combat, maybe especially if they were hoping for Valhalla.
Okay, makes sense. What about more everyday items, tools and things?
Tools, household items, those reflected the person's daily life, maybe their profession. It signaled a kind of continuity, like they'd need these things to carry on their existence after death. Animals, too, like horses or dogs, were often sacrificed and included. The idea was they'd accompany their owner, provide transport or companionship in the next world.
But you mentioned one detail from the sources that's particularly striking, has a really human touch.
Right. In the Gokstad ship burial, that famous 9th century one, alongside all the weapons and tools, they also found gaming pieces.
Gaming pieces, like for a board game or something. That seems like such a specific, personal detail to include.
It does, doesn't it? But it offers this really powerful insight. It strongly suggests that the Vikings believed personal leisure activities, aspects of their identity beyond just being a warrior or a farmer, actually continued in the afterlife.
That's a really intimate little detail. It kind of cuts through the whole fearsome warrior stereotype again.
It really does. And it beautifully sums up the multifaceted role of grave goods. They weren't just offerings to gods or just practical tools for the afterlife. They were also deeply personal symbols reflecting the deceased's life, their status, their individual identity.
So, okay, we've kind of journeyed from debunking that myth of the dirty Viking, exploring their surprisingly detailed grooming, understanding the deep significance of an everyday thing like a comb, and finally, digging into their complex beliefs about death and the afterlife through their funeral rites.
And what the sources taken together really show us is just how much more there was to the Viking world than just, the raiding and the conquest we always hear about.
Yeah.
These intimate details, how they cared for themselves, the craftsmanship they put into personal items like combs, the intricate beliefs woven into their funerals, they reveal a people who cared about personal presentation, who valued specific objects immensely, and who held these incredibly complex understandings of life, death, and what might come next.
It's that incredible contrast, isn't it? The terrifying raider image right alongside the image of someone carefully grooming their hair with a beautifully carved comb or being laid to rest with their favorite board game. That's what makes studying these sources so compelling.
It really forces you to look beyond the surface, beyond the stereotype.
It really does. And it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other seemingly mundane objects from the past might hold equally rich insights into the lives and beliefs of ancient peoples? And maybe even, what is our own relationship with our most personal items today? Our phones, maybe that worn-out comfort object, a specific piece of jewelry. What does that say about us?
That's a fascinating question to think about, definitely.
Indeed. Well, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the perhaps surprising world of Viking hygiene and funeral rite.